actually find themselves in these gigantic data center systems. This is kind of like, so for example, all the banks have these huge data centers where they're recording all this information about what the current state of your bank account is. And this is the reality. We don't have time to go into the nature of modern money and stuff, but the reality of the modern payment system is it's this here. It's you interacting with these data centers. And if you want a sort of quick representation of that, this is a very crude representation, but this is how, we already have mass digitization in finance. You know, it's like, you just might not perceive it. The entire electronic payment system operates on this kind of model where you have a way of interfacing with the bank database system, effectively. So for example, your normal bank account, on your internet bank account, you identify yourself via some kind of authentication protocol saying, I am Brett, this proves that I own this particular account. And then I communicate via the electronic communications infrastructure with the bank's databases. And I try to edit those databases and try to make changes. And then something it gets to their data centers and they make alterations to these circuit boards here. And this is how money moves around in the modern monetary system. And so, if I want to make a transaction between me and Sven, I send a message to my bank, and I ask my bank to edit their database system and to tell Sven's bank to do the same with their database, and then suddenly our money moves from one account to another. Really what's happened is we do information change, and then they sort that out among themselves at the central bank. I mean, the EU, the Euro system is slightly more complicated, but this is already mass how most of the monetary system works. We can discuss that if you want, but that's a huge issue. So, this is not really though, I spent a lot of time into the London financial technology scene, which is all these startups working on sort of financial, new type of finance. And there's this, what's called the future of money narrative. They always talk about the future of money. So they had these conferences about the future of money. And really, the guys involved in this scene are never really talking about the nature of money. They're never really talking about what is money, and what are the politics of money, and what are the actual cultural underpinnings of money. They're always talking about how do you move it around better, or slightly differently. It's really about payment systems they refer to. So I'm just going to quickly go into some of this dynamic. A large part of the sort of buzz around us, all about just different ways of interfacing with that system I just showed you. So for example, actually this is a friend of mine who's quite an interesting little project here. How do you create, her name is Heidi Hinder, it's like, how do you create more human ways of doing electronic transactions? You know, so you can have a handshake electronic transaction, a hug electronic transaction, and she's concerned that electronic transactions are creating more and more distance between people. So she's trying to create a sort of humanized version of sort of contactless payment. But of course, a lot of the big tech companies are interested in this. Like, how do you use your mobile phone in order to interact with that system there? So instead of using your computer, you'll have a phone. But it'll all end up in the exact same system again. There's no actual challenge at all to the fundamental underlying infrastructure of how banking works. So a lot of the innovation is kind of like at this sort of outer edges. And that's what all these sort of payment startups are doing. So payment startups are kind of like one sort of big area here. What we are, the sort of like the next phase of digitalization we're talking about now is also this attempt to move to branchless banking, or to effectively have no human interface in banking. And this is like quite a controversial area. So here I just picked up some Google imagery. The old school bank branch where you were able to walk in and interact with your bank managers in some way. And then moving up to sort of like your modern branch. And I've said a hybrid branch there because really, if you ever actually go into one of these banks, you'll notice that the people who work there aren't really, they effectively are glorified data processors. So they have a digital infrastructure that they then interact with, and you go via them to interact with that infrastructure. Right? So they don't actually have much power to do anything for you beyond what their computer says they're allowed to do. Okay? Now you'll probably discover this when you go to banks and you try to ask questions, and you say, well, can I just have a slide every day? No, I'm afraid the sheet says you have to, you know, are you a lawyer, a journalist, a banker, or painter? There's no other options. You know, these are obviously it's more than that, but they have these like set things you can do with them. It's not like an actual human interaction process often. So we basically see this trend, but the kind of like the next frontier is this world of having no branches at all. Here's an example of actually a German company, Creditec, who's talking about algorithmic banking. Look at the kind of rhetoric they're using there. Banking as we know it today is dead. Your branch won't exist in 10 years. And they're very certain about this. And these are all the cost-intensive manual banking processes. And when they say cost-intensive manual banking processes, they mean humans, basically. That's a sort of a code word for having to actually exert human labor. So what these guys are doing is they're attempting, so if you think about how do you eliminate all these costly processes of interaction, well, you have to have, when we interact with each other personally, we have to have like a sort of sense of a person. So the old school bank manager would be trying to assess the person's character, they would be trying to sort of get a sense of whether they were interacting with. Of course, in these systems, if you don't have a human involved, you have to have new ways of assessing people. So effectively, a lot of the sort of buzz is around, for example, analyzing social media profiles. Like, can we have an algorithm scrape through your LinkedIn profile and your Twitter feeds and get a sense of who you are? Without actually having a human involved, and have some sort of kind of clever machine learning type processes. And so these guys are, you know, pretty. They claim to be successful. I'm not sure how well they've done. But what's important to notice is that while as an individual startup, the people who are really interested in this are the big banks themselves. So in the United Kingdom, Barclays, for example, set up this Barclays Accelerator. And what do they effectively try to do is they create these innovation ecosystems. So Barclays itself doesn't necessarily want to do all the innovation itself, but it wants to keep a track of who else is doing innovation so it can kind of condition what people are aspiring to. So Barclays sort of funds all these tech startups to some extent. If they do well, Barclays basically will buy them out. Will get some kind of equity interest in them. If they fail, then, well, they failed, right? So it's quite possible that somebody like Barclays might at some point buy somebody like Creditec and they'll incorporate all the stuff into their own platform. This is how the corporate ecosystem works, or the innovation ecosystem. You have all these big players who then outsource innovation to all these small startups, and they weed them out as they fail, and they select the ones that's win. So it's quite evolutionary in a sense. So that's quite interesting. Problematic potentially, or I guess the question for sort of cooperative banks and social banks is, can you co-opt this process yourself, or sort of get into that and actually be the people that are trying to define what the innovation should be, rather than groups like Barclays. Here's a quick interesting one to show you, which is a slightly different approach. It's worth checking out. It's a project called Open Bank Project. Basically, they're trying to say, look, okay, so we have this legacy infrastructure here. How about we create a third-party layer on top of it, where individual people are able to sort of create apps that exist on top of this infrastructure. A bit like the iPhone, they made the hardware, and they allow third-party developers to create all these cool apps for it. This is what Open Banks projects, their vision is. And the key thing to make this work is what they call bank APIs. So Application Protocol Interface is the long word for it. But basically it means, right now with banks, I'm not able to pull data out of those private database systems. I can interact with it, but I can't change stuff directly. With APIs, you're able to actually have third parties build on top of the bank's infrastructure and actually be an intermediary in changing some of the stuff that's going on. This is quite controversial in banks because they're very worried about the security that's involved in this. Like if we open up our database systems, what will happen? You know, will there be security breaches? Will there be, who knows? So this is a very difficult project that these guys are working on, but they've got some kind of it's worth checking it out. Is that kind of clear so far? I've got a fair amount to go through, so I might be rushing a bit.
Rushing by speaking slower.
Okay, I'll try. Alright.
Always those natives speak.
Okay, so the banking side is just one of these, it's just one of the scene. There's a whole new world right now coming up in these other sort of financial startups which are targeting other elements of the financial sector. So for example, and this is again in the mainstream innovation scene, right? This is not like alternative innovation. This is a group called Wealthfront who's trying to do algorithmic wealth management. So this has been very, very popular with tech startup entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley who've all made a lot of money from creating tech startups and now want a new sort of modern way of doing wealth management. Basically, they don't interact with any humans. They go into the system and algorithms decide how they should invest their newfound riches. This has been very, very popular. I mean, like, they've got 2.4 billion under management already, and it's all from like people under 30, basically. A lot of these tech entrepreneurs. And so that's quite an interesting one. And there's a whole slew of these types of services coming out. Here's another one called Robinhood, which is this new app-based trading interface where you can basically, again, you don't have any humans involved. It's completely algorithmic. You have your phone, and then you can trade on the stock market for almost no cost. Okay. And again, what these guys are always pitching themselves as is democratizing finance. All right. In other words, bypassing the traditional intermediaries who were involved. Of course, you might want to ask yourself, what kind of person has the money to be doing stock trading? Is this really, who are you democratizing finance for exactly? And here's another example of this, which is called Quantopian. Again, look at this sort of language of democratization, leveling Wall Street's playing field, for the little person, as it were, except what this is algorithmic trading. So very, very quantitative, often high-speed trading. And then this platform allows you to build your own algorithms to sort of do trading on stock markets. Okay. And this is what a lot of the sort of venture capital scene, all the sort of private investment going into financial technologies around these kind of sort of algorithmic platforms. Now, one sort of political question we've got to ask ourselves at this point is, a lot of the rhetoric around the scene is about democratizing finance by using technology. But there's another school of thought, which is sort of critical technology studies, which is about, is this really democratization, or is what you're doing, are you basically creating new forms of algorithmic authoritarianism, as it were, or ways that you, algorithms start to control your actions? And this is what the famous saying, computer says no. You go into a computer and it says no, you can't do it, sorry. And it's like, well, can I ask your manager? It's like, there is no manager. You cannot bypass the system and I say no. That's a form of computer authoritarianism. This is what a lot of online forums, for example, are very good at this. If you ever have a complaint with a big company and you say, can I lodge a complaint? Say, here's the form, and the form only has 3 options. And it's like, if your complaint doesn't follow those, you have no voice at all. And then it says, thank you for lodging your complaint. We will come back to you at some point, but you'll never really know. And so there's this whole form of like very subtle kind of authoritarian edge to a lot of this algorithmic stuff, which there's a lot of very good critique around it if you are interested in going into that world. A good person to read on this is a guy called Evgeny Morozov, who's a sort of Harvard professor who is very sharp. The other question to ask about this as well is around big data surveillance. In terms of the critical analysis of this, a lot of what these companies are trying to do is create purely internet-based or purely digital-based systems which effectively leave huge data trails. So if every single transaction that I am doing involves an interaction with a computer database, it means every single interaction is recorded in the memory of the computer database, which means, for example, if you get a bank account at age, let's say, maybe early like 12 or something, they'll have a day-by-day record of every single thing you've done for example, the last 20 years. Now that data stream becomes a very, very important potential source of revenue for companies when they can work out exactly who you are based on these sort of behavioral patterns and the changes over time as well. So there's a whole world around big data analysis, which is like, how can we take these streams and make sort of meaningful sense out of them? Of course, this is something you have to grapple with because it's not worth shying away from it, it's worth trying to sort of figure out governance around those systems and how you actually interact with them and how you protect people in the process. Okay. I don't know if I've got about 10 or so minutes left there.
Yes.
All right. Yeah, I'm going to get through. Okay, so let's go to different seeds. I just describe what I thought was like the mainstream innovation around digital finance. There's a whole sort of like other world going on the sort of fringes of mainstream innovation, which is built around blockchain finance, which is a huge topic which we won't have time to go through properly, but I mean, how many of you are aware of Bitcoin and will have a sense of you understand Bitcoin system? Okay, I'll do a very, very quick description. So we had this picture I showed earlier, which you notice you have an intermediary system between these two people here, doing payments. The Bitcoin system is very, very similar, actually. What it really does is it replaces that centralized oligopoly with a distributed network. Okay, so note that this is still an intermediary system. You still have two people who are not directly dealing with each other, but are dealing with a sort of thing in the middle. But note that the intermediary itself is a whole network of people, rather than singular banks. Now, this is quite important for a lot of people in terms of the politics of this stuff, because these types of blockchain systems enable you to bypass sort of singular intermediaries and to rather put it in a sort of diffuse network of people. All right. And the other sort of key difference here, and again, I don't have time to go into the details of this, but in this system, the way that money moves is that the banks have these private databases that they change and they edit. And you ask them to edit those databases. And these are private databases. In the Bitcoin system, you basically have a giant public database, which they call the blockchain. All right, so it's a huge public system of recording, and then you interact with the system. So you can basically, it's highly transparent in many ways. You can see every single transaction that happens in the system. Now this is, if anybody wants to talk to me about Bitcoin, you can discuss afterwards. Okay, here's what it looks like in reality. Here's, for example, my Bitcoin account. It looks almost like an internet banking interface, and you can say, send money to that address there. Which is a little bit like saying send money to somebody else's account number in a mobile banking system. But you can maybe sort of send these electronic messages out to that network and ask them to move money from your address to somebody else's address. And that's what's happening there. And then here is a list of transactions that are going on. You can see it. And actually everybody can see these transactions. So it's in some ways a very transparent system. Now this Bitcoin system is now sort of the basis of a whole bunch of a new startup community around, for example, remittances. People are interested in, can you use this system to create sort of cheap international remittance markets? Which is quite an interesting one. You basically, for example, go from, you use US dollars to buy Bitcoin, and then you transform those Bitcoins into, for example, Kenyan shillings on the other side. And so it becomes like an intermediary currency between other currencies. Again, I don't have enough time to go into the details of that, but this is one of the sort of, in the sort of Bitcoin startup scene, people are interested in that type of system. There's also a whole world of alternative cryptocurrencies, which are different permutations on Bitcoin. The one sort of ideological strand you find in the Bitcoin community, and for that matter, a lot of the technology community, is the idea that you solve social problems through technology. All right, and so you have all these sort of narratives coming out in the tech sector and the Bitcoin sector, is that you can solve all these issues as long as you can just put technology into stuff, which is obviously something you really want to critique because it's a very problematic narrative in many ways. Here, for example, two old white men discussing how Bitcoin will end world poverty. Now, you can imagine the sheer levels of disconnection between how this guy sitting at the table thinks that he knows Bitcoin will solve world poverty. I mean, it's obviously complete crap, right? And these are sports magazines. A lot of this vision is around this idea that Bitcoin is a new way of recording property rights. So a lot of this rhetoric coming out of here is that we've discovered a new way to create hard-coded property rights in countries that previously struggled to uphold property rights. So for example, let's take Somalia, where you have a weak state governance system and you might not have strong protection of property rights. These guys will talk about, well, we could use this system to create sort of hard-coded property rights systems that people can then use to create markets between themselves, then lift them out of poverty based on the notion that markets will lift you out of poverty. Okay, so there's a lot of this rhetoric going on in the Bitcoin community. Okay. This is a platform you should look at, Ethereum, which is basically trying to do, take the Bitcoin system and apply it to completely new things beyond currency. So for example, being able to use that blockchain system to record contracts between people, being able to record sort of what are called, I guess sort of programs. Let's take this room, for example. And this is potentially quite interesting to consider from the perspective of cooperation. Right now, a lot of the way that our cooperation systems work, or was it the banking system works, is that you can all cooperate with each other via an intermediary like me, for example. Let's say I was a bank, and then you're able to engage in payments between each other via me. Now the question a lot of the blockchain community is asking is, can you take out that intermediary and rather have all of you collectively run the same software, which allows you to collectively create a system that starts to exist above all of you, which you can all use to collectively manage yourselves. And this is where this kind of notion of what's now being called, I was going to skip through that, distributed collaborative organizations is emerging. This is like quite an intriguing thing, this idea that you can create these large-scale collaboration systems without having singular intermediaries involved. And this is very, very new, and nobody quite knows how this is supposed to work. And this is a guy called Joel Dietz who's trying to allow people to create these organizations. And here's another one here called Blockstream. And notice what the rhetoric now is, we're creating systems that allow you to trust each other without an intermediary being involved. Okay, so previously you would have, for example, a bank as a trust intermediary. For example, you might not trust somebody over there, so you go via this trust intermediary in the middle. But these systems allow you to potentially create trust systems that go beyond intermediaries. Is that roughly? Okay. I'm going to have to rush through. Can I have 5 minutes? Is that cool? Okay. Because I'm going to skip through a bunch of the stuff here. So the takeaway point from that is that be aware of blockchain technology and what it's doing. It's worth checking out. You probably already are aware of this sort of movement towards DIY finance and P2P platforms. This has already been mentioned. Now, to some extent, this is kind of it's pretty straightforward territory, creating infrastructure that allow them to deal with each other. And it's already been mentioned in some of the talks today, perhaps cooperative banks would be creating these as sort of auxiliary projects within the cooperative bank, allowing their members to sort of engage in direct finance with each other. So I don't know, I'm going to skip through there. But yeah, this scene is definitely growing, and here, for example, is a really cool one in the UK called Abundance, which is allows people to lend directly to wind power projects. You could imagine something like this being integrated into, say, a sustainable bank as well, as part of the sort of product offering. Here's a share certificate that I own in another illustration. I bought a share in something called Trillion Fund, which itself is a peer-to-peer lending platform, and I bought it by another peer-to-peer lending platform called Seeders. So there's this whole world of like being able to raise money on these crowdfunding platforms. And here's another very cool one called a beer company in the UK, which raised money directly from people without an investment bank being involved. They issued their own shares, and it was called Equity for Punks. You can see it's all sort of like male aesthetic, these guys like drinking beer, owning the company at the same time. So it's going to be quite fun kind of thing. Okay, so be aware of that world around sort of move towards DIY finance, peer-to-peer finance. The last sort of section I thought would be worth mentioning is this digital technology can also, a lot of the original vision was that you can use it to move away from the local. But there's a whole world around can you use digital technology to get people to reconnect to the local. And that's sort of quite a well-known one, at least in the UK, is the bricks and pounds system. because we now develop these, a phone app which allows you to use this local currency by sending text messages on your phone. But it's only usable within a local area. A couple of was mentioned. Here's a cool one. Some of you might know in Sardinia, which is a mutual credit system. Sardex, which is joining together small businesses in Sardinia. It's a different system to the Brexit account. We can discuss how it's different, but it's definitely quite a successful example. There's town banking systems, and here's the one I really want to show you, which is a friend of mine made this, which is a way of using Twitter to print your own currency or print promises to people. It's called Pump Money. So it's allowed bilateral printing of promises, and then you can sort of track who promised who to what, who promised who what. Okay, I'm going to end there because I've been
Is that legally binding? No.
Sorry?
Is that legally binding?
What's that?
Legally binding for those promises?
No, it's not legally binding. It's a pure gift economy system, so it's based on trust. Okay, I'm going to end there. I almost got through my slides.